Então, pessoal, bom dia a todos. Vamos iniciar aqui a nossa reunião da Óptica Cirúrgica dessa semana. Hoje com um tema muito especial, um palestrante igualmente conceituado para falar desse tema, que é o mapa epitelial. Talvez não utilizado ainda por muitos, mas que com certeza é uma coisa aí que veio para ficar, né? Então, devido ao nosso convidado aqui, vamos trocar o nosso idioma hoje para inglês, tá? E eu desejo a todos uma boa reunião. Good morning for everyone who listens to us in Brazil. And today is a very special meeting. We'll be discussing about corneal epithelial maps. And for this, we had the honor to have with us Dr. Abhijit Sinha Roy. And well, I thank you very, very much, Dr. Roy, for being here with us. I believe it's a good evening right now in Bangalore, right? And we'll start this meeting with a discussion of a published paper that's going to be presented by Dr. Gabriel Murad, and then we'll have the lecture from Dr. Roy. So please, Gabriel.
Good morning, everyone, and good evening. We have people in different time zones today here. My name is Gabriel Murad. I am the fellow from the Surgical Optics Division of Escola Plástica de Medicina's Department of Ophthalmology. And I'm gonna do the research paper discussion in today's meeting. So for today's discussion, I bring this article from the Journal of Cataract and Refractive Surgery, which was published in 2017. And it's titled, Distinguishing Between Contact Lens Warpage and Ectasia, Usefulness of Optical Coherence Tomography Epithelial Thickness Mapping. The authors are from the University of San Francisco, California, the Department of Ophthalmology from the University of San Francisco. And right off the bat, I already bring the disclosure that some of the authors, three of them actually, have significant financial interests in OptiView, which is one of the technologies that will be used in the methods of this study. Other than this, no other authors have any financial or proprietary interests in the material and methods of this study. So the background for the discussion we're going to have today is that we have keratoconus as the most important risk factor for ectasia for patients that undergo corneal refractive surgery. Frank keratoconus, the cases that have many important topography alterations, can be quite easy, let's say like that, to diagnose for many ophthalmologists. However, now we also have the form-fruit keratoconus, which is where the doubts and the difficulty, the challenges come in order to diagnose. And the form-fruit keratoconus is also a very important risk factor for iatrogenic ectasia. So we as refractive surgeons have to be very cautious with this form of keratoconus, especially when analyzing the patients that are candidates for refractive surgery. And on the other hand, we have the warpage, which can have similar topography images to the form-fruit keratoconus. However, it's not a corneal ectasia. It is a contact lens related alteration in the cornea that usually is reversible when you stop the contact lens wearing of the patient. And then we have the corneal epithelium, which acts as a filter over the corneal irregularities. It has this behavior that over the irregularities both of the keratoconus and the warpage. And this epithelium can be mapped using OCT technology. So with this in mind, our authors ask if the epithelial thickness mapping can distinguish between the ectasia and the warpage to help differentiate between these two conditions. In order to answer this question, the authors select patients and put them in 4 groups. The first group, the keratoconus group, are patients with the keratoconus percent index of over 100. This index is a diagnostic tool for keratoconus. I'm not going to go into depth in this subject, but just for those of the audience who never heard of it, it's an index, of course, that when over 100 highly suggests keratoconus in its description. The form-fused keratoconus group were the better eyes of patients with asymmetric keratoconus. So when you have normal keratoconus percent index, which would be below 60, between 60 and 100, this index would be cases that they're not conclusive. Over 100 would be highly suggestive, and below 60 would be considered normal. However, in this group, we already know they have keratoconus because of the other eye. And these patients did not use contact lens for 1 month prior in order to differentiate them from the contact lens warpage group, which are patients with inferior corneal steepening. However, this resolved after discontinuation of contact lens usage. And then there's the normal group, which the authors didn't specify in details what they consider normal, but it's safe to assume that it would be patients with neither of these three conditions. The imaging for this study was performed with the RT-View OCT with the pachymetry plus corneal power scan pattern, 8 areas with a total area of scan of 6 millimeters. And Scheimpflug or scanning slit for the topography maps, the axial power and the mean power images. With these images that the authors performed, the locations of the maximum axial power and the maximum and minimal epithelial thickness were located based on sector averages. And the outermost 5 to 6 millimeters were excluded because these readings were less reliable. So only the 5 millimeters, central millimeters were considered. This is just an image. This is an example. I'm going to talk about this image in more detail later on, but just to show what the authors acquired from each image. So we have the upper images here, the mean curvature and the axial power map, which were performed in this example with scanning slit, the topography. However, it could also be done with Scheimpflug. And the bottom images, the epithelium map and the pachymetry, was with the OCT, with the scan pattern described. And then the authors have this sector map, which is divided in the central area and 8 sectors, peripheral sectors, which he used in order to map the maximum epithelial thickness, the minimum epithelial thickness, and the maximum corneal power using the previous maps. So just to make this clearer, we have that image, okay? And then he would put this sector map that he acquired or he developed for this study, perhaps, and then he would put over, for example, in the mean curvature map in this example, and then he would find what is the yes, in this yellow dot, the maximum mean power on this map. The same would be done for the axial power, looking for the maximum axial power. And then for the epithelium map, he would use the same sector map that I showed before and find the minimum epithelial thickness and the maximum epithelial thickness. And then he would compare all of these findings just a moment, yeah, to look for if there was agreement between the findings. And what he would define as agreements is if the minimum or maximum epithelial thickness and the maximum mean or axial power were in the same or adjacent sectors. The same, of course, is the same and adjacent would be the ones in the close to the sector that the other measurement would be. For the results of this study, first of all, he managed to obtain 13 patients and 21 eyes for the keratoconus group, 6 patients and 6 eyes for the form-fused keratoconus group, 8 patients and 15 eyes for the contact lens warpage group, and 19 patients and 18 eyes for the normal patients. The mean manifest refractive error of the contact lens wearers was minus 7.2 sphere diopters, ranging from minus 3 to minus 11.75. And the cylinder was minus 0.9, ranging from 0 to plus 2.25. And from the contact lens group, 8 were wearing rigid lenses and 7 were soft toric lenses. This first table here shows the epithelial thickness characteristic in each of the groups. What we can observe here that is important and is that when we look at the warpage group and the keratoconus group, we see that the minimum epithelial thickness is lower than if we look at the form-fused keratoconus and the normal group. while the maximum epithelial thickness is also higher. So it has a higher maximum and a lower minimum. So, and the author describes this as being a wider range of epithelial thicknesses in these two groups, the warp age group and the keratoconus group. However, only the keratoconus group had a statistically significant difference from the normal group, with a p of less than 0.01 in value. The OCT epithelial map in patients with keratoconus showed a focal thinning in a distribution similar to the mean power map topographic findings. I'm going to show this in some images soon enough, but just to have the concept here. And this was also true for the form-fruit keratoconus group. However, on the patients with warp age, the OCT epithelial map showed focal epithelial thickening instead of thinning, which was what he found in the keratoconus group. So the author then shows us one example of each group. This is the same image that I showed before in order to have the example of the sector map. And so this yellow dot here shows in the mean curvature map shows what would represent the maximum mean power here, the mean curvature. And then we have here this red dot showing the minimum epithelial thickness. And we can see he doesn't give us the example with the sector, of course, but he describes, and we can see that it belongs in adjacent sectors, which would define as agreement, as the methodology explained. This is a form-fruit keratoconus example. So of course, it's a lot less obvious when you look at the mean curvature and axial power maps alone than the previous example. However, if we do the same procedure, which would be finding the maximum mean curvature and the minimum epithelial thickness, we see that they also coincide, which is what the author described as the finding for both of these groups. However, the warp age group, on the other hand, so we see this is a topographic image that is similar to form-fruit keratoconus, which is something that can be found in contact lens induced warp age. However, the K here coincides with the maximum epithelial thickness, not the thinnest, not the minimum, which was what he found for keratoconus and form-fruit keratoconus. In this table, he gives us more details of what we just talked about. So it's the percentage of agreements between the locations of epithelial thickness and the topography in each of these three groups. And if he compares the maximum epithelial thickness and the maximum mean power, we see that it is 100% in the contact lens warp age of agreement, 50% in the form-fruit keratoconus, and very low of 19% only in the keratoconus group. This pattern is also observed if instead of the mean power, we use the axial keratometry. However, instead of 100%, it's 93% in the warp age group. However, if you switch between maximum epithelial thickness to minimum epithelial thickness, this is reversed, okay? So the keratoconus group becomes much closer to 100% for both the mean and the actual maps. The form-fruit keratoconus goes to 83%, which is, of course, lower than the keratoconus group. However, it's still a lot closer to 100. Then the warp age groups would go to 36% only. This was statistically different between the keratoconus group and the contact lens warp age group, as he describes here in this text box that also put here in this slide. Then he gives us this example, which was the one exception that he describes for the keratoconus group. If you go back to the table, we see that 20 of 21 patients here in this third row had a positive association between the minimum epithelial thickness and the maximum mean power. However, this is the one exception that he found, and the author describes that it is because here in this superior periphery of the epithelium map, there is an area which is much thinner than the rest of the epithelial map. However, if not for this area, then the second thinnest would correspond to the maximum K of the mean curvature map. So for the conclusion of the article, that if we look at the question that the authors asked before, can epithelial thickness mapping distinguish ectasia and warpage? Yes, according to the data we just saw. However, I would like to open some discussion points of this study. First of all, it seems to be a non-masked study. The authors don't go into details whether the person who was evaluating the maps knew beforehand to which group each patient belonged. So by this, it's not clear if it is a masked or non-masked study. The long-term results of the patients considered to have warpage may be interesting to know if they were, if surgery was performed, and if so, if they had a satisfactory response, if they had post-operative ectasia or not, in order for us to see if this was actually a reliable finding of this study. Of course, the low number of patients in each group is something that catches our attention. However, it is a small study, of course. He's just proposing to us a new tool of differential diagnosis, not necessarily. Of course, we can do other studies to see if this holds true for bigger populations. And then something that I believe may happen on the keratoconus exception that he showed us the image is that maybe that was an artifact of image segmentation error. We have to look at the OCT image in order to see if that thing, the superior peripheral thinning that he showed, if that is actually there or if just an error of the image. But talking about an exception of this rule, this is not from the study. Okay, this image is from a patient of the refractive surgery clinic of Escola Paulista de Medicina. This is a patient that has had keratoconus for many years already. There is no doubt of the diagnosis. And we can see that the anterior axial map here shows readings of 78.5 and 77, so very high readings of K. I put this yellow dot over here, to which may correspond to the maximum axial power here. And then if you look at the epithelial map of the same patient, this is the OCT image, and these are the maps, okay? We can see that this corresponds to the maximum epithelial thickness here. So if we go for the methodology, by the methodology that we just saw in the study, this particular case would correspond to contact lens warpage and not a keratoconus case, which we know beforehand that is not true. So I just brought this here because this case was being discussed this week, the week prior. And I think it was interesting to show this together with this study in order for us to discuss. And these are the topics that I wanted to bring. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Murad. Excellent presentation. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Abhijit Singh Roy. He completed his master's in mechanical engineering, and he also spent a lot of time in his postdoc at Cleveland Clinic, and he developed a great experience in biomechanical models and in the area of corneal biomechanics. He also has many publications and a great interest in corneal imaging, and that's what he will bring to us today, talking about corneal epithelial maps. We are very pleased to have you with us, Dr. Roy, and please feel free to comment anything you like. I don't know if you already knew this article beforehand, and what do you think? Are these findings, they look very interesting, but I don't know if they have been reproduced afterwards. And what do you think about this concept, and also about this particular case that Dr. Murad brought to us, where obviously that calling this a warpage isn't adequate, but it's just an example of a case where in advanced keratoconus, we have this focal epithelial thickening instead of thinning. So please, Dr. Roy, welcome.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and yeah, it was a great presentation with respect to this paper. So your specific question is with respect to this case. So again, the concept of warpage in keratoconus really should apply to the mild and the early cases. Okay, so that's when you would see the corneal shape undergoing a true warpage from its healthy shape. Now, in this case, this is a very advanced case. And if I were to look at the corneal volume of this particular patient, it would be quite low compared to, somebody who is in the mild case or in the early stage. So this is more, I would not call this case really a corneal warpage, because this is a situation where there is actually loss of tissue mass. All right. Whereas in case of the early KC cases, that's, those are the cases where you can call them warpage. So I'm assuming that many of you will have corneal tomographers in your practice, and most tomographers give a measure of corneal volume. So you can easily check the magnitude of corneal volumes that you would expect in your healthy corneal patients and early and mild keratoconus, and you should then see the KC patient, which is this, and you will see that there will be quite a bit of difference. So I would call this a pure degeneration than calling this a warpage scenario at this point. Yeah.
Thank you for your kind words, and Dr. Wright. Please feel free to start your lecture if you wish.
Yeah. Is that right now? Okay. So, well, once again, would like to thank you and the organizers for this invitation. And the previous talk by Dr. Murad nicely set up, so I don't have to cover the basics of epithelial mapping. But in our group here at Narayana Nitwale, Bangalore, we are looking for next generation evaluation techniques of the epithelium thickness. Okay, and so we are trying to look beyond what is conventionally being reported in publications or being used in clinics, such as minimum epithelial thickness, mean epithelial thickness, etc. Because the epithelium is really a three-dimensional structure. It varies in thickness over the space of the cornea, and when it comes to cornea, we have so many diverse metrics. You have curvatures, you have aberrations, where you look at those numbers spatially, but it's really I would say a limitation currently that epithelium is only looked in terms of certain finite values at certain discrete locations of the cornea. So I'm going to show how we can truly evaluate the epithelium thickness in 3D, and how this 3-dimensional information can also be beneficial for something which we have come up very recently, a very exciting tool for biomechanics. So I would like to, in the beginning, thank the funding that we have received from our institute and from various government agencies and from companies. And we have some IP filings also related to the imaging and biomechanics work that we are presenting here. So, so in the beginning, I would like to start with this slide. So we have on the left a healthy eye with uniform epithelium. So the anterior curvature is the first plot there. And then you have the epithelial thickness of this patient next to it. So it's fairly uniform, although you do see some color variations. But we also will have patients where the eye is healthy, okay, but there is an irregular epithelium. So the plot on the right side, the top right side, you see the anterior curvature there, but here you see that the epithelium thickness actually kind of looks like an early keratoconic patient. But is this patient really, progressing towards keratoconus? Not yet. This is just an example of how true epithelium thickness can vary over the space of the cornea, and therefore you have to be very careful in evaluating which patients are true cases and which patients are healthy. And then we have a case of a form fruit keratoconus, which is on the lower left-hand side. You can see the inferior steepening, and therefore, it's very early into the disease. And here you can clearly see in the corresponding epithelium map, which is next to it, that there is some amount of thinning where the zone is steep, and there is some amount of steepening in the zone opposite to it. And then on the lower right-hand side, you have a Frank Casey case, which has been beautifully described in the previous talk, where the areas of steepening correspond to areas of marked epithelium thickness that you can see in this area with the blue. And then you also see, corresponding areas of steepening away from the steep zones. So I think the take home from this slide is that if you look at the top row, there are two examples of a healthy eye, one with fairly regular epithelium, whereas the other has a irregular epithelium. And therefore, when it comes to healthy cases, we have to be very careful how we evaluate the epithelium thickness maps. So why is uniform epithelium assumption such a, I would say, should not be assumed for every eye or every case that you come across with? So let's assume that this is over here, we are showing a schematic of a cornea with uniform epithelium. And for examples here, I've just said that, the epithelial thickness is 50 microns everywhere. Now, let's say you want to cut a flap of 100 microns, and therefore the stroma would be also 50 microns in thickness. But now, if you have an irregular epithelium, which is, let's say, 40 microns in the center and 50 microns in the periphery, if we were to do a flap of 100 microns, you can clearly see that the stroma would be approximately 60 microns in the center, whereas the flap thickness at the center would be approximately 60 microns, whereas in the periphery it would be around 50 microns. So this brings into question whether the assumption of uniform epithelium is indeed valid for the healthy cases that we operate upon, for refractive surgery. So the epithelial thickness map on the left is the previous example I showed, which is showing a fairly uniform thickness, whereas the one on the right is showing another healthy cornea, but with not that uniform epithelial thickness. So what we then decided was that we need to come up with better metrics of describing the three-dimensional variation in the epithelial thickness. So here is an OptiView map where you can see the central 2 millimeter zone and the different sectors. This was described in the previous talk. And what is described in these sectors is the average epithelial thickness in each. So in the center it is 48, then in the superior sector it's 51, and so on. Since we are talking about corneal tomography, I'm assuming that most of you would be familiar with Zernike polynomials. So Zernike polynomials are a very unique set of equations that actually help you describe any three-dimensional corneal information. So whether it is wavefront, whether it is elevation, whether it is aberrations, Zernike polynomials is able to describe it very nicely. So we hypothesize that even the thickness which you see, which is the epithelium thickness, and even the corneal thickness is also a unique distribution of corneal physiology. And instead of having wavefront, so sorry to bother you with one equation here, where generally when we look at aberrations, we have the wavefront being described by the Zernike polynomials indicated by this equation here, which is Z. So we simply replace the wavefront aberrations with thickness, and now the same Zernike polynomials such as defocus, astigmatism, comas, SA, and the RMS of the lower order and the RMS of the higher order Zernike polynomials can be used to describe the three-dimensional variation in epithelial thickness. So how does this work in principle? So I'll describe it with an example. So the first figure on the top shows a uniform epithelial thickness distribution. So it's a uniform green color. Let's say it's around 58 microns. Now, assuming that we have different Zernike components coming into play. So let's say assume a defocus component. So if I assume a defocus thickness distribution, then in the center, in this example, there is almost a 3.5 micron increase in thickness. But as you go to the periphery of the map, there is a decrease in the epithelial thickness concentration by minus 3.5. Now, if I look at a vertical coma thickness distribution, which is the third figure which is the third figure in the first row. Here you can see that there is in the superior zone there is an increase in the epithelium thickness by around 5 microns in the superior, but there is a decrease in the epithelial thickness by around -5 microns in the inferior. So this is a coma type distribution of epithelium thickness. So these Zernike polynomials are able to describe the three-dimensional variation in epithelial thickness beautifully. Similarly, if you go to the bottom figure, which is the E horizontal coma, you see a horizontal coma epithelial thickness distribution. And if I take all these thickness distributions and add them up, which is indicated by the plus sign here, we end up with a net epithelial thickness. I'm sorry for the labeling there. This should have been epithelial thickness here. So we end up with a net epithelial thickness distribution where it looks very similar to how a keratoconic cornea would be. So you have a region of thinning here, which is around 45 microns, and then you have a region of thickening here, which is around 63 microns. And this is indicative very classically of how the keratoconic epithelial thickness distribution is. So now we have a formulation which is capable of describing the three-dimensional spatial epithelial thickness distribution very nicely. And you just are not limited to what is the mean or the minimum or the maximum. Okay, so you have a kind of an equivalence. So how does this these indices vary from cases of uniform epithelium to cases of irregular epithelium? So in this case, when I say uniform and irregular, they are still healthy corneas, and then we look at form first keratoconus and keratoconus cases. And if you see the individual Zernike components, which is defocus, coma, and SA, they do tend to vary a lot between the groups. And if you look at the net result, which is the RMS values, here you can see, for example, in the lower order, how nicely these indices vary between the different groups of corneas here. So the blue bar indicates the healthy corneas with the uniform epithelium, fairly uniform. The orange is for corneas with irregular epitheliums, but healthy. The 1.75, which is the gray columns, indicates the form fruste, and the yellow ones, the yellow bars are for the keratoconus. And if you look at the higher order terms, you can clearly see distinction between the early cases and the frank clinical cases in this case. So these indices have much better sensitivity and specificity in separating out the different groups of corneas here. So we used this formulation, this method of analysis to first look at whether these Zernike indices can actually differentiate between flap and flapless refractive procedures. So by flap, we are implying actually should be between flap and flap cap, because you have flap in LASIK and cap in SMILE, and flapless procedure, which would be PRKs. And in this case, so in this study, the LASIK procedure was performed with the wavelight laser. The SMILE was performed with the Zeiss Visumax. And there were two groups of PRKs, one which is the manual PRK, where the epithelium is removed manually, and then trans PRK, where the laser does the complete procedure. And we looked at 3-month postoperative outcomes using the OptiView anterior segment OCT, and we mapped the epithelial thickness distribution using the Zernike parameters in the study. Since the Zernike parameters number a lot, we went ahead and even looked at a decision tree classifier to see if we can actually distinguish between the flap cap and the surface procedures. And then we went one step further to find out if the epithelial remodeling postoperatively can distinguish between all types of procedures. This paper was published in Journal of Refractive Surgery. So digging into the results of the study, when we looked at the mean, minimum, maximum, there was no difference between the different procedures. When we looked at the change in epithelial thickness in the superior inferior zone, again, there was no statistically significant difference between the different surgical platforms. Now, all these surgical platforms, SMILE, LASIK, and PRK, trans PRK, vary very distinctly between each other. But still, local values of epithelial thickness change did not indicate any difference in wound healing after the surgery. Now, why is this? So it goes back to the fundamental issue with corneal tomography imaging with tomographers. So we use the OptiView, which is an anterior segment OCT. The anterior segment OCT, in this case, has a resolution of around 5 to 6 microns optically, which means that theoretically, if you look at 1 pixel, it would be indicative of around 5 to 6 microns. Now, if you look at the change in the mean epithelial thickness, it was minus 5.2 in SMILE, minus 3.86 in the, it was minus 3.86 in LASIK, minus 5.63 in PRK, and minus 4.47 in trans PRK. Minus in this case is indicating a slight increase in the thickness. But what is important here is that between the procedures, the difference in the change in thickness was somewhere between I would say 1 to 2 microns. And like I said, that optically we are able to distinguish with each pixel only around 5 to 6 microns. So there's no way we can measure changes which are less than 5 microns reliably for an individual patient. So therefore, in this case, from the study, it's quite clear that if you're trying to evaluate changes in epithelial thickness by just looking at local changes, that is looking at either mean or minimum maximum, we will not be able to derive meaningful remodeling features from the different surgical platforms. However, when we use the epithelial Zernike indices, so now please keep in mind that we are not only mapping the local changes in thickness, but we are mapping the three-dimensional change in epithelial thickness over the entire corneal geometry. So it's the entire, in this case, if you consider the older Optoview, it would be around 6 millimeters size. And here, once we started looking at the differences between the different Zernike indices, we clearly saw differences in remodeling or wound healing between the different surgeries. So therefore, definitely the quantification of the three-dimensional distribution of epithelial thickness has a much better clinical role than just looking at local values. So then we went ahead and also looked at how we can use this three-dimensional map of epithelium between two transepithelial PRK platforms. So in this case, we looked at two groups of patients, one which underwent surgery with the wavelight laser, and the other which underwent surgery with the Schwind laser. And we looked at the post-operative outcomes and compared the epithelial maps with the pre-operative outcomes. And here also we use some amount of artificial intelligence to find out if the post-operative remodeling in the epithelial Zernike indices was indicative of difference between the two trans-PRK platforms. And here, once again, if you point your attention to the figure on the right, which shows the epithelial distortion index, between each group of patients, that is between the two trans-PRK group of patients, we clearly saw a remodeling difference, whereas where the Schwind, the patients who had undergone trans-PRK with the Schwind laser had much quicker epithelial remodeling than the wavelight laser. And this was kind of expected preoperatively also, because the Streamlight platform, removes epithelium from, let's say, a central 8 to 9 millimeter zone, whereas the Schwind trans-PRK platform removes epithelium only specific to the ablation zone. So while the mean, minimum, maximum epithelial thickness did not distinguish between the two trans-PRK platforms, the epithelial Zernike indices clearly showed differences between the two trans-PRK platforms. So in other words, if I were to be given these two groups of patients and I were to be told that these two groups of patients underwent trans-PRK with two different platforms, then I would be able to pinpoint which group of patients underwent surgery with the Schwind and which group of patients underwent surgery with the Streamlight. So this three-dimensional mapping of epithelial thickness seems to be a much more potent evaluator of post-operative healing compared to just evaluating the local thicknesses. So we have since moved on and applied this three-dimensional mapping of epithelium corneal thickness also, and also curvature and aberrations have come up with a universal architecture of diagnosing early keratoconus using corneal tomography and AI. And this study is currently under review, but this is a quite a large sample size study where we had almost 527 healthy eyes. We had 144 eyes with very asymmetric ectasia, and we had keratoconus eyes with a sample size of almost 454. And And when we looked at the performance of our AI model, where we could not only diagnose the healthy cases with regular and irregular epithelium, but also diagnose the very early ectasias, we got excellent performance, which is indicated by this area under the curve of the random forest, where we achieved an area under the curve of almost 0.972. So the uniqueness of this diagnostic model is it not only includes curvature aberrations, it also includes the three-dimensional distribution of epithelial and corneal thickness, and all the information is evaluated with the same set of mathematical descriptors, which is in this case Zernike polynomials. Okay. Going ahead from that same paper, we could also show very clearly that with the use of these epithelial Zernike indices, which maps the three-dimensional distribution of the thickness, we were able to achieve a much better segregation between healthy corneas, very asymmetric healthy corneas, very asymmetric ectasia, healthy corneas. So in this case, these are corneas where one eye is keratoconus, but the other eye looks clinically normal. And then very asymmetric ectasias, these are the KC eyes of those of these patients, and then and the bilateral KC cases. So we were able to achieve a very clear distinction between all groups of corneas. And so how does the future of epithelial imaging look like? So I did mention earlier that when we look at epithelial thickness with the current scanners that are there in the market, they are in the range of 5 to 6 microns. The most recent one, which is the MS39, actually gives somewhere around, I think, 3.5 to 4 microns optical resolution. But we actually have a custom OCT, which we have built in our clinic, which gives us almost 1.4 microns per pixel. And therefore, it increases the sensitivity and specificity of detecting even the smallest changes in the epithelial thickness multifold. So this is an example I should say examples where the top row shows the epithelial mass that were imaged with the MS39 from CS Italia. This is a 6.4 millimeter scan. And the bottom row shows the same epithelium, the same eyes imaged with our custom scanner. And we are scanning almost 8 millimeter to 8 millimeter with it, which is very similar to the newer OptiView scanner that is there in the market. So as you can see that we are able to capture very nicely the epithelial thickness maps. But what is most important is that with the enhanced resolution, you're not only able to map the epithelial thickness, you're also able to map the Bowman's layer thickness in these patients. So the top row shows the anterior curvature of the select eyes. So the first row is healthy corneas. The second row is thin corneas, which is in this case, the cornea had a thickness, central corneal thickness of around 450 microns. The third and the fourth column is an asymmetric KC patient where the right eye was frank KC and the left eye, as far as curvature goes, wasn't really indicative of KC. And then the last column is a frank KC eye. And if you look at the epithelial thickness map of these eyes, which is there in the second row, it's quite clear that which cases are indicative of disease. But what is very exciting is that now we are even able to map the Bowman's layer thickness. And so you can see that the Bowman's layer thickness in KC eyes also kind of describes the same pattern as the epithelium thickness. Most interestingly, if you look at the KC fellow eye, which is the left eye, the third column, you can clearly see that even though the epithelial thickness is showing some signs of early disease, the Bowman's layer is still quite healthy. And there is a lot of biological and inflammatory aspects to this, which is getting, it's kind of going beyond the scope of this talk. But what I would like to pass a message from this map is that even though the epithelium is thinning, the fact that the Bowman's layer is still quite uniform in thickness is indicative that this eye is quite stable. And maybe that's the reason why the left eye is looking quite normal, whereas as far as curvature goes, whereas the right eye has advanced so aggressively into keratoconus. Okay, so digging more into that, this is another example which I'm showing here. The top row is the keratoconic eye of the patient, and the second row is the fellow eye of the same patient. And as you can see that while the epithelial thickness in the KCI is very indicative because you see the thinning which is there at where the curvature is steep. In the KC fellow eye, you actually see an increase in the thickness of the epithelium right centrally. So, it can throw you off because why is that one eye, which is keratoconus, is showing epithelial thickness map, whereas the fellow eye, which may have some early signs of keratoconus based on curvature, the epithelial thickness is not indicating anything. And therefore, we go back and look at the Bowman's layer thickness map. And in the keratoconic eye, we can clearly see that the Bowman's layer thickness also shows thinning and looks kind of similar in pattern to the epithelial thickness, whereas in the fellow eye, the Bowman's layer thickness is very uniform. And therefore, it clearly shows that the disease has not yet progressed in the, or some may even argue that the disease actually may not exist in the fellow eye of this patient. So how do we use this information for biomechanics? And this is where our latest tool has come out, which we call the AccuSumX in partnership with Oculus. So some of you may be familiar with the Corvus, which is available for biomechanical assessment. And in combination with Pentacam, we have a lot of indices which help us to evaluate what is the preoperative biomechanical status. But none of these indices indicate what would be the post-operative status, that is the post-operative stiffness of the cornea, because these are just diagnostic indices which give you one cross-sectional analysis. So this is an example. You can see the patient underwent a -6.5, maybe spherical equivalent. And if you look at the BAD-D, the CBI, TBI, they were all quite normal. Okay. They underwent SMILE. And when we looked at, when these patients came in for follow-up after 3.5 years, we saw indications of ectasia in these eyes. So though the current indices from the Corvus and were indicating a healthy status, clearly we are missing out something because we are not getting predictions of what the post-operative biomechanical status of these corneas would be. So this is where AccuSumX comes into the picture. Among the research domain, biomechanical modeling of the cornea has existed for many decades, but this has not translated in the clinic. What the biomechanical model actually helps us do is to map out the mechanical strain in the cornea, and using that strain information, we can derive what the mechanical properties of the cornea is. And once you have the mechanical properties, you can input the surgical parameters that you want to simulate and actually derive what the post-operative corneal stiffness would be. And this can actually help you decide which eye is suitable for a given surgery much better than just looking at the current cross-sectional indices which are reported by the devices. So we have published the heart of this software many years back in 2018 IIVS. You're more than welcome to refer to this paper, which is before, but I would like to highlight the key results from this paper. So if you look at the figure on the top, this was the preoperative measurement for a set of eyes, and the dotted line shows how close the software was able to estimate the preoperative deformation. And from this, the dotted line indicates the preoperative estimate, and from this deformation, we were able to derive the biomechanical properties. When we use these biomechanical properties and the intended surgical correction and the type of surgery, the bottom figure on the right shows actually how well we were able to predict the post-operative corneal deformation if the cornea was to be remeasured with the Corvus. So the solid lines once again show the actual measurement in the post-operative state, whereas the dotted line shows the prediction that was delivered by the software. So as you can see that we are able to predict the post-operative corneal deformation if evaluated the Corvus very accurately if we are to use biomechanical models which actually rely on corneal structure and corneal physiology. So this is a snapshot of the software. It's very easy to use. You can input your Pentacam and Corvus measurements. You have surgery-specific models, biomechanical models to simulate, so it can be SMILE, LASIK, PRK. But what I would like to draw your attention is to this information on the extreme right, where you see epithelium thickness. So you can actually enter what was the preoperative epithelium thickness if you assume a uniform thickness for the particular case. But if you happen to have some of the modern tomographers like MS39, you can even input a customized thickness, which is in this case would be the regular epithelium that the patient has. And this is the patient interface. So how does epithelium thickness, sorry, before I go to the actual description, this slide shows how well the software is able to predict. So on the x-axis, we have the software predicted postoperative stiffness indicated by KC mean, and the y-axis shows what was actually measured in the patient postoperatively. And you can see here that there is almost a one-to-one correspondence between the prediction and the measurement. And the red dots here show the, you can see some red solid circles here. So these are eyes which actually develop ectasia. And our softwares actually can pick up which eyes would end up being ectasia, even though these eyes are pretty much in the on the lower half of the population distribution. So how does patient-specific epithelial thickness come into play for biomechanics simulation? So this is an example which I wish to show to you. So that at the top, we have the simulations results where the preoperative measurement is indicated by this vertical black line, and then the postoperative prediction is also shown in this figure. And what we predicted in this case was a change in the corneal stiffness, which is the decrease in corneal thickness stiffness by around 13.21. But when we use the variable, that is, sorry, the irregular epithelial thickness in the same simulation model, we actually got a prediction of 9.9, which was way lower than a uniform epithelial thickness distribution. So we actually showed that this patient, if underwent a particular surgery with a non-uniform or irregular or a non-uniform epithelial thickness distribution, the change in the corneal stiffness would be far lower, and therefore the surgery would be much safer in this case. So these are some more interesting cases. So the first one, which you can see here, is PRK, and the second one, which is labeled as SMILE. So you can see that the change in the epithelial thickness indicated by those two vertical black lines in the first figure is much smaller than the change in the stiffness in the SMILE eye. So obviously PRK was indicated to be much safer in this case than the SMILE surgery, which is almost 2.6 times lower change in stiffness. So you may be tempted to perform PRK in this particular patient rather than SMILE. Here is another example indicated by subject 1. So in the right eye, you can see that the CBI and TBI was 0.14 and 0.31, whereas in the left eye, the CBI TBI was 0.05 and 0.13. Now here, the CBI TBI in the right eye was indicated that probably the biomechanical status, that is stiffness of the cornea, was little inferior than the left eye. And this is but when we went ahead and did the simulations, we actually found that it was actually the right eye, which, when we actually did the simulations, we actually found exactly the same situation where the right eye was biomechanically better than the left eye, and therefore you could appropriately choose the right surgery for this patient. Similarly, there is another example, which is subject 2, and in this case, you see the right eye, the CBI TBI was 0.12 and this should be 0.09, whereas in the left eye, the CBI TBI is 0.05, 0.12. Both are very normal. And when we simulated, I think SMILE was simulated in this patient, what we observed was in the subject 2, the right eye, the change in the corneal stiffness was around 13.6, whereas in the left eye, the change in corneal stiffness was around 16.7. So definitely the use of SMILE in the left eye caused a much greater change in corneal stiffness than the right eye. And of course, this is a prediction. So you may be tempted to maybe choose PRK for this patient to achieve a less change in the stiffness rather than doing SMILE. So this kind of preoperative modeling using customized, I won't say customized, using the custom, that is the patient-specific epithelial thickness, really gives you the true prediction or the true capability to look into the future as far as the biomechanical status of the cornea is. So to sum up, what we discussed today was that the epithelial Zernicke is help you in identifying surgery-specific three-dimensional remodeling of the thickness, rather than just looking at the local measurements of epithelial thickness only. Therefore, going ahead, looking into the future, more descriptive parameters of three-dimensional remodeling of the epithelium are required. Our second paper clearly showed that even between the surface ablation procedures, which is in this case is the trans-PRK procedures, EZI was, that is the epithelial Zernike indices, were very capable of identifying which corneas underwent more remodeling spatially than just looking at the mean minimum values. And last but not the least, hopefully this publication should come out soon, where we are proposing a universal architecture where the same mathematical descriptors are used for evaluating corneal aberrations, curvature, thickness of the epithelium, and the stroma for much better improved diagnosis of those suspicious cases and early disease cases. With this, I'd like to thank my research team and also our clinical team headed by Dr. Rohit Shetty, who have been very instrumental and very helpful in helping us achieve such great volume of work, and really looking into the future of thickness mapping, which is, I think, very critically needed in the clinics today. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Roy. And such a fantastic talk with so many applications of the epithelial mapping, and also some gazes into the future, and maybe not so far ahead of us. It's happening right now, right? And
yes,
well, I would like to ask if Dr. Chamon would like to comment as well. I believe he could say some words about Zernike applications and intelligence, artificial intelligence also. Please, Dr. Professor Wallace.
Hi, Abhish.
hello. Yeah,
Beautiful, beautiful presentation and excellent line of work. I would love to have more people addressing the subject as you're doing. I have no doubts that using polynomials is a much more sensitive way to evaluate surfaces or 3D differences than looking at the raw data itself. So congratulations for that.
thank you.
I have one question for you. It's
Yeah.
not going to be easy to go back to the slides, but I'll try to make it clear.
Sure.
When you showed, I'm sorry, when you showed that looking at the numbers of post-operative superior, inferior epithelium thickness, you weren't able to detect differences between the techniques used, but you were able to detect using the Zernike polynomials. What strikes me is that although the superior inferior differences, as you said, were within the error of the measurement, they were equally different. What I mean is the thickness, the superior and the inferior thickness on SMILE were higher than the superior and inferior thickness on PRK, or I don't remember the groups now, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Although you could not differentiate them, and we were very clear about that because it was within the error of the measurement. But wouldn't it indicate that maybe there was a misinterpretation of epithelium thickness in such a way that after a SMILE, you're measuring a thicker epithelium because you maybe are getting some inflammation or some other landmark, and therefore the instrument isn't measuring accurately in different techniques. I don't know if I was clear.
So, yeah, I understand what you're trying to say. So it goes back to the way the information is being presented currently. So in the OptiView maps, maybe I can show the slides because it's easier to explain. So I will share this current slide. Okay, so can you see the slide?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in this, so this is how OptiView currently presents it. So in the central 2 millimeter zone, it's reporting a value of 48. Okay, so this 48 is an average of all the epithelium thickness in this central zone. But clearly there is a thinner epithelium in the superior, whereas there is a thicker epithelium in the inferior zone. So when we are presenting average of a zone, it's just presenting the wrong information, because you can have a 48 micron central epithelium thickness for a healthy case also, and you can have a 48 for a disease case also. So this is the point I was trying to stress on, that when we are looking at local values, which is an average of a zone, you are going to miss out the spatial variation in the epithelial thickness. So for example, when you're looking at keratoconus, you are interested in the steep zone. You look at the Ks in that zone. But if I were to take an average of the anterior curvature over the central 6 millimeter of a mild keratoconus, it might be the same as a healthy case. And therefore, you will completely miss out that information. So unfortunately, the field, although the diagnostic devices are available there, somehow the metrics haven't advanced into the clinic. And I think even Dr. David Huang, who is a big name in the field of OCTs and also involved with a lot of work with the OptiView, he has come up with some newer work on describing the three-dimensional spatial variation in epithelial thickness. He calls it the pattern, I think the pattern something, I forgot the name of the index, but they are also looking at how to map out the distribution of the epithelium thickness spatially, because then you can capture out regional variations much better than just looking at the mean values.
Dr. Brenner is waiting to talk, but I have one more question for you.
Sure.
On the higher order aberrations, let's say on the epithelium thickness, what I mean is, if you have a very delicate changes, maybe if you filter the higher order aberrations, you could detect any other disease, because keratoconus are lower order aberrations. I mean, I would expect lower order aberrations change, as you showed, comma, maybe 3.
So this is the complex part here, that when you're looking at the interaction between the different layers, so the epithelium is thinning, the stroma is also thinning. So there is an interaction. So what if the epithelium is thinning, but the stroma hasn't yet shown any thinning? So is it still, keratoconus, early keratoconus? It's going to be debatable. Okay, and that's where I think that artificial intelligence comes into play, because your clinical information, that is your clinical diagnostics, combined with AI of mapping the three-dimensional distributions of every feature of the cornea, whether it is thickness, curvature, elevation, aberrations, is really the way forward. Okay, and we cannot just restrict ourselves just to aberrations or posterior elevation. So right now the field is quite fragmented. I think different experts, clinical experts, will promote different aspects of evaluating keratoconus, either look at curvature, look at posterior floor, but really all that information needs to be combined into one model. And that is what we are looking to achieve.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Excellent. For such a young researcher.
Well, I'm not that young anymore.
Dr. Brenner, it's nice to see you here. Dr. Brenner from Norway. So please.
Yes. Very nice. Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. It's a very interesting topic. And yes, indeed, the epithelial map is the new frontier in refractive surgery. And I think that when you show this epithelial Zernick cases, most for normal corneas, I think that in our clinical practice, this is not the exactly point, which is the difficult part. What I mean to say is that for highly aberrated corneas, Yes, I think that's the most difficult part now, is to account for the epithelium thickness profile in regarding our precision and predictability. So, for example, my question is, we face a lot of patients who had previous refractive surgery for 10, 15 years ago with small optical zones. And those patients, they come to us with a regression or a progression of the metropia. And we need to do a new treatment in the cornea. We don't want to lift the flap. We don't want to cut a new flap. So we need to use a PRK technique or a trans-PRK technique. And we know that the epithelial remodeling profile is different from the normal, from the virgin cornea. So how can you use these epithelial Zernike indices to try to compensate for refractive errors due to an irregular epithelium for corneas, highly aberrated corneas, or previous treated corneas, especially in myopic and versus hyperopic previous treatments?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So actually, we need to go beyond just looking at the thickness in such cases. So our group has also shown previously that we can map out the curvature of the Bowman's layer. Okay, and so when you talked about regression, is that regression happening because of stromal changes, or is it happening because of epithelial changes? So
probably
that's
both.
Probably both. So that's the aspect that needs to be addressed by doing epithelial mapping, and also by mapping the curvature of the Bowman's layer. So that's very easily doable. We have papers where we have showed that using OCT, we can also calculate the curvature of the Bowman's layer, and that will give you a precise indication of which layer is to blame here. So looking ahead, again, it comes back to the same thing, that we need to, come up with three-dimensional mapping of the epithelium very soon in the clinic. So we have also shown that in cases of early keratoconus, as is expected, even if there is a subtle change in the epithelial thickness, the stromal change is far greater, and therefore the stromal, that is the Bowman's curvature that you get, would be at least a half a diopter or half a diopter, 0.75 diopter more than what you see on the anterior surface, that is the anterior corneal curvature. Okay, so going ahead, I think in your case, a combination of the two, that is mapping the epithelial Zernike, which can help you plan the customized ablation, and mapping the Bowman's curvature can help you delineate which surface is responsible for the regression. In fact, if I'm not wrong, so a couple of laser manufacturers of LASIK and PRK platforms are already looking into how to include the OCT epithelial thickness match directly into the ablation maps. So it's already in process, I would say, in some cases.
Okay, but just one more question. Regarding the epithelial Zernike indices, when you say that you calculate those polynomials based on epithelial thickness, it's a direct translation from thickness to micra in some Zernike polynomials. Do you use any formulas? How is
no, it's a direct translation. So it's the same as doing for aberrations. So when we calculate aberrations, we have an aberration map that you see on your tomographers, and the Zernike polynomials are just used to capture that 3D aberration map. Now you remove the aberration and just put a thickness map. The same polynomials can be used to capture the three-dimensional distribution of thickness. So essentially, every descriptor of cornea, whether it is elevation, whether it is thickness, whether it is curvature aberrations, can be effectively mapped by one set of functions. So that is the beauty of the technique, that you have the same mathematical descriptors for everything.
Okay, nice. But For example, if I have a patient, there is just an example, and I can measure the epithelial thickness, and I can see that the central epithelium is, for example, 7 micra thicker than periphery. So we can think that this lenticle is like half diopter in refraction. If you think that 15 micra is 1 diopter in ablation, for example. So I can do this some mathematically in my clinical practice. Would it be a big mistake if I make it some without the software, just making this trying nomogram to try to compensate this?
In some cases maybe it's okay, but as I was saying previously, that if you're looking at most of you would probably have the OptiView anterior segment OCT. The anterior segment OCT from OptiView gives you the mean epithelium thickness in a zone.
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah. So when you are, let's say the central zone gives you 50, the superior zone gives you 45, but the inferior zone gives you 60. Then what do you do? So which marker do you use to estimate how much dioptric compensation to accommodate for? So it can get challenging. So honestly, I don't expect clinicians to start thinking about complex calculations like this before the surgery. I mean, it has to be made in a way where the entire information is decomposed, that is three-dimensional information decomposed into something like this and made available to you, so that you can just, I mean, the easiest way would be that if the patient-specific epithelial maps are just directly used in the ablation laser platforms.
Yes, perfect. Yes. And do you think this, your platform in the internet, is AcuSimX, can make these calculations?
So the platform AcuSimX is tailor-made to do the biomechanical calculations. Okay, so
but not ablation profile or compensation.
Not at the moment.
Okay.
So we have something in the works, but that will be released in future versions. So right now, AcuSimX is looking at biomechanical predictions. We also have a platform which is tailor-made for customized corneal cross-linking. Okay, where we can use patient-specific tomography maps to get you patient-specific customized profiles. Okay, that's looking into the future. And customized ablation maps, yes, that will come in the future, because now we have a very nice setup for mapping out epithelial thicknesses. Yeah.
Okay, very nice. Thank you very much. Thank you for your help. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Abhishek, how do you get the data from the tomographic maps? Do you need the file, or can you look at the image?
So if you're talking about all of these have to be OCTs, right? So in case of the OptiView, we use the image, but if we are using, let's say, the MS39, which is from CS Italia, they give you a file export of the epithelial thicknesses. So we use that in that case. I mean, we can work with both. It depends on what you have.
Okay. Then one more question, just as a curiosity for you.
Yeah.
In the 90s, our group used Zernike polynomials to describe anterior surface on corneal topography, placido-disc corneal topography, and artificial intelligence. So the idea was exactly the same. We did have a surface. We did not have the power to evaluate the surface itself. At that time, 90s we're talking about. Then we used the Zernike polynomials to differentiate or to label our AI to differentiate between keratoconus and normal eyes. It was presented at Harvard in 1995, I believe.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Like I said, I think the data and the information has existed. The analytics have not progressed as far as thickness distributions are. So I think a lot of researchers and on both the science and the clinical sides have come out with their own indices. But really, what we felt is we don't need to develop newer indices all the time. Let's use, the Zernikeys, which are used quite commonly to evaluate corneas. And the same formulation can be used for, like you said, curvature as well as thicknesses. Yeah.
And once again, congratulations for your work.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We hopefully will have you soon in person here to be talking to us and teaching us. And
sure.
What's your interface for? You said you already have an interface for personalized cross-linking, or not yet? Not available yet.
So we have the interface. So it's a software module included within AccuSMX.
Oh,
so yeah. So essentially, again, there's a big challenge. So there's only one customized cross-linking platform in the market, right? Which is from Video. Now it's Glaucos. So we are working both on a hardware as well as the software side to come out with a more cost-effective customized cross-linking, and the software will help you with the planning, because corneal tomography is one aspect of keratoconus. Biomechanics is also another aspect. So currently the treatments are being driven by tomography. They don't consider the biomechanics. We want to combine both of them and give you a treatment plan. So we have a proof of concept paper is, we have submitted. It's currently under review. So hopefully once that's out, it's available to all of you to evaluate and critique and help us guide better on it. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah.
Dr. Roy, about this of cross-linking as well, you've published a correspondence, I believe a letter, talking about cross-linking time in thin corneas. Do you also customize cross-linking for thin corneas in your software package as well?
No. So thin corneas do not require that, and I think it's an overkill. I think thin corneas, we just need to stabilize them, period. Okay. Those corneas, like I said, it goes back to, the discussion which you're having, like warpage versus degeneration. You want to do customized cross-linking for corneas which are early or mild. You should not look to do customized for those thin corneas, because there the goal should be to just preserve the cornea. Okay. And I would not recommend doing customized protocols for them. Yeah.
I believe you meant to customize the energy needed for a thin cornea.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. So the energy needed. Okay, yeah, definitely you do need to do that, because if you see all the work that has been published, for example, by Farhad Hafezi, and then really, the first set of work on thin corneas was shown by Eberhard Spürl, and I think they have clearly showed that you do need to titrate the energies for thin corneas, but you necessarily do not need to titrate the UV intensity spatial. So when I was talking about customized corneal cross-linking, I was talking about titrating the UV energy spatially, okay, so that you give more UV to the disease zone and less UV to the I won't say non-disease, but less disease zones. Okay, so your UV, the amount of corneal surface that is exposed to UV goes down drastically. But in thin corneas, because they are so progressed into the disease, you would ideally like to do a larger diameter, and you would just reduce the amount of energy that you're delivering. So either you can reduce the power or you can reduce the treatment time, the UV on time. Yeah.
And also about a question that has been brought by Dr. Francisco Bandeira before, about the segmentation. I believe many of the recent articles on epithelial mapping, the images are manually adjusted. Do you also perform that in your routine? And if that is still a barrier to its widespread application in the clinical setting?
Yes, so that's a very good question. So in all our studies, we assess the edge segmentation for each B scan, okay? But I cannot say with 100% confidence that in the clinic, when clinicians are evaluating patients, they actually look at segmentation. So in fact, we have a small commentary on this in GRS, where even, we have highlighted this issue in Pentacam, where it's just a matter of resolution. If if you don't have enough depth resolution optically, it's always going to be a challenge to segment those layers efficiently. So I would definitely recommend, all of you, that for corneas that are, let's say, moderate to advanced, to always look at the edge detections, whether it's, Scheimpflug or OCT, you should always look into it. Our own custom scanner, where we have a very high optical resolution, which is going down to below 2 microns, it's much better, but again, such kind of technology doesn't exist commercially, at least yet. So we hope that something like that will come out soon in the future. We are also working towards it.
And also, Dr. Rai, do you have any thoughts about epithelial mapping and intrastromal ring implants, and how they modify, and also how to read adequately these maps?
Yeah, it's another treatment technique for keratoconus. So yes, they will also have a very distinct epithelial remodeling. And I think most of you have seen that in your practice. Like I said, going ahead, if we have an architecture where there is three-dimensional mapping and we have artificial intelligence, you should be able to identify every cornea post-operatively, that yes, this is a ICRS, this is a LASIK, this is a SMILE. I think it's doable. So yes, even the rings will have a distinct signature. Okay, and they will obviously, I think, in terms of comparing rings with all other corneal procedures, yes, I mean, they will have a very distinct remodeling feature there. Yeah.
Great. Thank you once again for your amazing lecture and commentaries as well. And as we have kind of exhausted you with all these questions.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you for your time and such a late hours in India as
no problem.
Well.
Yeah, please go.
I would like to remind for our audience that I'll send the code for today in the chat, and don't forget to fill out the evaluation form as well. And well, any final remarks or comments? Yes, sure. Francisco, please feel free to ask your questions as well.
Sorry, I wasn't able to follow up with the whole lecture. I'm busy at clinics, but I have a few moments, and this is a subject that I'm very interested in corneal epithelial mapping. And I have a more philosophical question to Professor Roy. You said that the epithelium is a 3D structure. I would defy that and say it's a 4D structure, because it changes over time.
Yeah.
So regarding this point, do you have any follow-up in repeated examinations over time with epithelial map? What is the reproducibility, the repeatability of this exam over time? Does it change in normal patients between exams in the morning and the afternoon? How do you see these changes? Because the epithelium is much more alive, let's put it this way, than the stroma and the endothelium. So how do you feel about this this point?
So yes, there would be some changes if you're doing it in the morning versus afternoon versus evening, because all of us are working. There are different environments that people are exposed to. But are these changes big enough to cause a refractive shift? So the answer is no. And if you look at repeatability in terms of that, the repeatability is excellent. So if you were to plan a surgery using an epithelial map acquired in the morning and to do a surgery in the afternoon, you won't be too off. But in case of a disease, yes, obviously, if you're evaluating it over a few months, you should always use the current epithelial map to plan out your treatment. You should not rely on maps that have been acquired a few months back. And I think the latest understanding as far as the trans-PRK ablation goes, even there, I think there is more and more push towards using epithelial maps which have been acquired just before the surgery, even for healthy corneas. Okay, So I think the Schwind laser also has some features to include spatially varying epithelial thickness in the ablation pattern. It's very simplistic in nature, but they are also trying to include this 3D information into the surgery on a given day. All right. So yes, definitely over a period of months, there can be some changes, but those changes will not be big enough to cause a refractive shift unless the patient ends up with a lot of inflammation or disease. That's a different situation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That's great. So thank you once again,
Thank you.
Dr. Roy. And I would like also to give a shout out to Dr. Marcela Solomon, who wasn't able to be here with us today, but it was a great pleasure holding this talk today. And well, for next week, we'll be back to cataract surgery with the University of South California and Carol Maia, and also a very renowned surgeon from here, from Brazil, Dr. Arthur Vandenberg, and we'll see some challenging cases for next week. So thank you all for the attention today, and especially for Dr. Abhijit and Dr. Murad for their presentations. And we wish you a very nice weekend and a very nice week for everyone. Bye-bye.